6 for 6. That's the headline. Iran fires 7 ballistic missiles at U.S. allies overnight. The Navy intercepts 6. The 7th breaks apart before it reaches anything. No U.S. personnel harmed. Clean win. Here's the question the headline skips. What did 6 successful intercepts actually cost? Not in some vague strategic sense. In dollars, per missile, per pull of the trigger. I'll give you that number before this video is over. And once you see it, you won't read missile defense headlines the same way again. Hold that question. There's one other thing I want to plant before we get into it. There's a number hiding inside this story that almost nobody outside military planning circles is watching. It's the most important number in the whole conversation. I'll get to it, but first you need to understand what actually happened Friday night, because it didn't start with Iran firing missiles. 12 hours before those 7 missiles launched, Iran sent 4 one-way attack drones toward the Strait of Hormuz. One way means they don't return. They fly into a target and detonate. The U.S. shot all 4 down before they reached anything. That was the trigger. When Iran attacks shipping lanes used by 13 million barrels of oil per day, you respond. So CENTCOM launched retaliatory strikes on Iranian coastal surveillance radar stations, one in a place called Garuk, one on Keshem Island. These are the systems Iran uses to watch ships move through the strait and coordinate its naval forces. Blind those stations, and Iran loses its picture of what's happening on the water. Iran's response came that night. 7 ballistic missiles, aimed at 2 targets. Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, which houses U.S. forces, and the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. 6 were intercepted by U.S. forces. The 7th broke apart on its own before reaching a target. Iran claimed it damaged the 5th Fleet headquarters. CENTCOM denied that. No U.S. personnel were harmed. So, the full chain looks like this. 4 Iranian drones, U.S. strikes on radar sites, 7 Iranian ballistic missiles, 6 U.S. intercepts. Each step triggered the next. And this exact pattern, provocation, U.S. response, Iranian escalation, U.S. interception, has been running for 100 days. It is not random, it has a logic. Understanding the logic is what this video is actually about. But first, how do you shoot down a ballistic missile? Most people have some picture of missile defense in their head. Probably Iron Dome footage from news coverage, rockets being knocked out of the sky over a city. That gives you the general idea. But what the U.S. Navy is doing is a significantly harder version of the same problem. And the difference matters. A ballistic missile is not like an airplane. An airplane moves slowly enough that you can track it, change plans, send new instructions, redirect your response. A ballistic missile goes up, reaches the upper atmosphere or briefly beyond it, and comes back down. The entire flight can take less than 10 minutes from launch to impact. At the descent phase, the final stretch before it hits, it's moving somewhere between 5 and 15 times the speed of sound, depending on the type. You have a very short window, and the window gets shorter the longer you wait. Here's what makes it technically tricky. You can't shoot it where the missile is. By the time your interceptor gets there, the missile has moved. You have to calculate where it's going to be. Based on radar tracking, trajectory modeling, and physics, fire your interceptor toward that point in space and hope both objects arrive at the same coordinate at the same moment, at hypersonic speed, frequently at night. The U.S. Navy does this with 3 layers of defense. Think of it as 3 lines of defense, each catching what the one above it missed. The first line is the SM-3. It's a missile launched from a Navy destroyer, a warship roughly the length of 2 football fields, that goes up to meet the incoming missile while it's still very high, sometimes above the atmosphere, before it starts its final descent. The SM-3 doesn't use an explosive warhead. It hits. Direct collision. Combined speeds measured in miles per second. If it connects, the threat is gone before it ever begins falling toward anyone on the ground. One shot, one chance. Enormous distances. A window measured in minutes. If the SM-3 misses, or if the incoming missile is too close to get a mid-course shot, the second layer fires. That's the SM-6. It intercepts in the terminal phase, when the missile is already screaming downward at full speed, and you're in the final seconds before impact. Much shorter window. The SM-6 uses an explosive warhead rather than a direct hit, which gives it a better chance when the geometry is nearly impossible. If both of those miss, the ground-based Patriot system is the last resort. PAC-3, if you've seen it in footage, the batteries that launch interceptors at close range. Patriot is what stops what everything else couldn't. 3 layers, 3 chances, against a missile that can cover hundreds of miles in the time it takes to make a phone call. Leave a comment if you've seen Iron Dome footage, because that comparison is worth making. Iron Dome is catching short-range, unguided rockets that travel for maybe 30 or 40 seconds. The Navy is catching ballistic missiles with trajectories that span hundreds of miles, moving at hypersonic speed, in a time window where a wrong calculation by a few seconds means the intercept misses entirely. Same concept. Entirely different league of difficulty. And consider what the crew aboard that destroyer is actually doing in real time. The Aegis system, the Navy's radar and targeting computer, is tracking the incoming missile from launch, projecting its trajectory, calculating an intercept point, and preparing a firing solution. The officer in the Combat Information Center has to authorize the engagement. The interceptor has to be in the right position. The ship has to be oriented correctly. All of this happens in minutes, sometimes less, while the crew knows other threats may be incoming simultaneously. Friday night there were 7 missiles. That's 7 separate tracking problems, 7 intercept calculations, 7 trigger decisions, some of them overlapping in time. 6 missiles intercepted on Friday night. CENTCOM hasn't specified which layers caught which missiles. What we know is that the system worked. Now here's the number I said I'd give you. An SM-3 interceptor costs approximately $30 million. That's not the ship it's launched from, not the crew running it, not the radar system tracking the threat. Just that one missile, the one that flies up and meets the incoming ballistic missile in space. An SM-6 costs roughly $4 to $5 million each. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor runs about $3 to $4 million. Iran's ballistic missiles, the variants it's been firing at Gulf targets, cost an estimated $1 to $3 million each to manufacture. Run that ratio. Even if the US used a mix of cheaper interceptors on those 6 missiles, the bill for one overnight intercept cycle runs into the tens of millions of dollars. If SM-3s were in the mix, and for ballistic missiles they often are, you're looking at somewhere between $50 and $150 million spent to stop an attack that cost Iran perhaps $7 to $20 million to execute. Iran spent $7 to $20 million. The US spent $50 to $150 million to stop it. Iran gets to reload. The US gets to print the headline, 6 for 6. That is the math the headline doesn't show you. Iran is running a business model that works in its favor, even when it loses every missile it fires. It spends $1. The US spends $5 to stop it. Iran reloads and waits for the next trigger point. 3 nights later, the same exchange runs again. Former CIA station chief Dan Hoffman framed it on Friday night coverage. Iran appears to be trying to drive up the costs of the war for the United States by disrupting trade and forcing interceptor expenditures. That is precisely the right frame. The missile isn't aimed at a building, it's aimed at a budget line and a stockpile level. And here's the compounding factor. The Gulf states' own air defense systems are also firing interceptors during these exchanges. Kuwait's military was actively intercepting during Friday's salvo. Bahrain activated air raid sirens and its own defenses. These are Allied systems drawing from Allied stockpiles that are, if anything, smaller than the US inventory. When Iran fires at Kuwait, it's draining not just US magazines, but the magazines of every partner defending that airspace. Now here's the number I mentioned at the very start, the one that matters more than any single overnight interception. As of late 2025, the US military had approximately 414 SM-3 interceptor missiles in its entire global stockpile. THAAD interceptors, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, the ground-based system that does a similar job at high altitude, stood at roughly 534. Those numbers cover everything. Every ship, every battery, every theater of operation from the Pacific to Europe to the Middle East. 414 SM-3s, 534 THAADs. That's the pool everything is drawn from. Now here's the recent history that makes those numbers land differently. Last June, the 12-day war, when Iran and Israel went directly at each other for 12 days, the US burned through approximately 150 THAAD interceptors and around 80 SM-3 missiles to help defend Israel. Not in a full-scale sustained war. In 12 days of an air campaign, That's roughly a quarter of the entire U.S. upper-tier interceptor stockpile in 12 days. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published analysis after the 12-day war with a specific phrase worth sitting with: a race of attrition. The side that runs out of interceptors first, before the other side runs out of missiles, is in serious trouble. One side's production line has to outrun the other side's missile factory. The 2026 war started February 28th. It is now 100 days old. It has not been as intense as the 12-day war for every one of those 100 days. There's been a ceasefire, there have been pauses, but there have also been interception cycles throughout. Every intercept in those 100 days drew from the same pool that was already down after June 2025. Nobody outside the Pentagon knows exactly where that pool stands right now. What we know is that it was finite going into the 12-day war, was drawn down by roughly 25% upper tier during that war, and has continued drawing down through 3.5 months of a larger conflict that shows no clear end date. One more data point worth holding on to. War on the Rocks published analysis after the 12-day war, suggesting that in a simultaneous Pacific conflict, if something involving China, Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. were to overlap with the Iran war, the U.S. could run out of upper-tier interceptors in approximately 24 hours. That scenario hasn't happened and may not happen, but it illustrates how thin the margin looks when you stack global commitments against a stockpile that was already finite and has been taking losses. Now here's the other side of the equation, Iran's side. Trump said it directly on Friday. In an NBC interview, he acknowledged that Iran retains approximately 21 to 22% of its pre-war missile arsenal. His words: "It's a lot of missiles, but it's not what it was when we first attacked." 21% of a large stockpile is still a meaningful number. Iran entered this war with one of the biggest ballistic missile inventories in the world. Years of production, specifically designed for this kind of sustained campaign. 1/5 of that inventory is still enough for weeks or months of overnight salvos. And the ceasefire, which has been nominally in effect since April and has been violated repeatedly by both sides, including by the Friday night exchange, has given Iran something valuable: time. Reports from early June indicate Iran has been digging new underground launch tunnels, restocking its missile supplies, and rebuilding parts of the manufacturing capacity the opening strikes tried to eliminate. CENTCOM's Admiral Brad Cooper told the Senate Armed Services Committee in May that U.S. strikes had degraded more than 85% of Iran's defense industrial base. That is a significant achievement that should not be dismissed. But 15% of a large industrial base is not nothing, and 15% with weeks of reduced pressure can produce, restock, and reload. Iran is not sitting and waiting for the war to end. It is using the ceasefire to reconstitute for the next round. Here's Iran's strategy, stated plainly. Iran does not need a missile to get through to win an exchange. Getting a missile through is the goal if possible, but it is not the primary goal. The primary goal is to make the U.S. keep firing interceptors, because every intercept costs the U.S. more than the missile cost Iran, and the U.S. stockpile is finite. 7 missiles fired Friday night, 6 intercepted, 0 reaching their target. Iran's reaction to that result? Acceptable. It spent roughly $7 to $20 million. The U.S. spent roughly $50 to $150 million. The U.S. stockpile is lower. The headline says 6 for 6. The U.S. looks effective, and Iran goes back to its production tunnels. Scale that exchange over 100 days with enough firing cycles, and you are running the U.S. interceptor stockpile toward a level where choices become harder. Not today, not tomorrow, but the direction of the trend is what matters, not the score on any given night. The U.S. understands this. Production ramp-ups are underway. Lockheed Martin signed a 7-year deal in January to produce roughly 2,000 Patriot interceptors per year, a major increase from previous rates. Raytheon is under contract to significantly scale up SM-3 production. THAAD output is being increased. These are the right decisions. The gap is the timeline. You sign a production contract today. The missiles arrive in 2 or 3 years. The war is happening now. The ramp-up doesn't solve this week's math problem, or next week's. It solves the problem for a future version of this conflict, if the current one lasts long enough. Friday night's result was real. 6 for 6 is a genuine operational achievement. The Navy crews running these systems are doing something technically difficult under actual operational pressure. tracking hypersonic targets in real time, calculating intercept windows in minutes, firing from destroyers in one of the most contested bodies of water on Earth. That is not easy, and it worked. Here's how to hold both things at once. The system worked on Friday night. The system is also being asked to work under a strategic framework that Iran specifically designed to exhaust it over time. Those two things are not contradictions. They're the full picture. Every one of those 6 intercepts cost millions of dollars, paid from a stockpile that was already drawn down before this war started, drawn down further during the 12-day war last June, and continuing to draw down through 100 days of the current conflict, against an adversary that is explicitly designed, in its strategy, in its production decisions, in its patience, to keep making the U.S. pay that cost until the payment becomes a problem. Think about what you've seen in this video as a ratio. Iran fires a missile, the U.S. intercepts it. Iran spends less than the U.S. spent to stop it. Iran reloads. The U.S.'s stockpile decreases. Repeat. The question is not whether the Navy can intercept. It clearly can. The question is how many repetitions this ratio can run before it starts mattering. At current production rates, analysts say the production ramp-up won't fully close the gap for years. The war is happening now. 6 for 6 is the beginning of a sentence. The full sentence is 6 for 6, at a cost the U.S. can sustain for now, from a stockpile that is not infinite, against an adversary that is actively restocking during a ceasefire and has built its campaign around making the U.S. keep shooting. The question isn't whether the Navy can intercept missiles. Friday night proves it can. The question is whether production can outrun consumption, and whether that race concludes before the stockpile math becomes the story instead of the intercept count. Write pace or drain in the comments. Does U.S. production ramp up fast enough to stay ahead of Iran's firing rate? And does the interceptor stockpile hold long enough for this war to reach a conclusion before the numbers become a real constraint? Or does Iran's patient reconstitution and the attrition math drain U.S. interceptors faster than production lines can replace them? 2 words, 2 different conclusions about where this goes. I read every one.